I'm Bron Tuller, and welcome to Psych Matter. In today's discussion, I want to talk about the topic of suicide. This month is September, which is National Suicide Awareness Month, so I felt like it was a fitting topic. More importantly, though, suicide is something that has touched all of us and is a very relevant topic in today's society. Suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States and the second leading cause of death in teens and young adults, roughly ages 14 to 24. In some form or fashion, all of us have had some experience with suicide, whether the loss of a loved one, the loss of a friend, or just hearing about it on the news. Suicide is an unfortunate, common thing that we run into in this day and age. By the end of this session, my hope is that we'll have a better understanding about what suicide is, those who are at risk for suicide, and most importantly, how we can help people who are suicidal, and equally as important, how we can help loved ones who are survivors of somebody who has committed suicide. So to start off this discussion, I want to talk a little bit about statistics first off. Now, if you're like me, statistics are painful and often not to be trusted, but they're important in this particular topic and in most of medicine because it helps us identify the importance of the topic that we're discussing, in this case, suicide. And it also helps with the identification of who is at risk for suicide. So hang with me, do your best. We're going to run through some numbers here. As I said in the introduction, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States and the second cause of death in teens and young adults ages 14 to 24 approximately. The most recent data that we have published is from 2017, and that's through the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. In 2017, there were an estimated 1,400,000 suicide attempts. Now, those are identified suicide attempts. In reality, there's probably a lot more. People tend to underreport suicide attempts because of taboo, because of repercussions and consequences for that. So in reality, that 1,400,000 is probably an underrepresentation of the actual suicide attempts. Still, that's 1.5 million people in that year who attempted suicide. Of that number, roughly 50,000 were successful in their suicide attempt, unfortunately. That's a success rate of about 30%. That's a staggering number. That's 14 people dying to suicide for every 100,000 people. So, some other statistics I want to run through, and these are important because this is really where we start to identify who might be at risk or other risk factors. So the first thing I want to go through is method for completions. This is important because if you can identify if somebody has access to certain things, you're going to be able to help them reduce the risk of suicide. The number one most dangerous method for attempting suicide is firearms. 50% of the deaths from suicide are through firearms, which makes sense. Firearms, in my opinion, are just far too deadly for somebody who has significant depression and is considering suicide. With some of the other suicide attempts, it takes a little bit more planning, a little bit more thought process. But with a firearm, it's a simple pull of the trigger, and the results are usually fatal. So 50% of deaths are from firearms. The second most dangerous is suffocation. Suffocation accounts for 28% of suicide deaths, and that's usually in the form of hanging. The third most dangerous is poisoning, and that's usually in the form of overdose, and that accounts for 14% of suicides. So that takes us to 92% for those of you who have been adding those percentages up. The remaining 8% is categorized as other methods for completing suicide. So firearms, most dangerous, suffocation, and poisoning. Those are by far the top 3 methods for completed suicide. Age is another risk factor that has to be taken into consideration. There's a hot spot for age, and that's ages 45 to 64. That age group is the most likely to have a completed suicide. The rate drops after that. So 64 and above drops back to be about the same risk as a young and older adult. But for some reason, that 45 to 64 age group is really where the completed suicides occur. Now, that's for completed suicides. Attempted suicides, by far, are more common in the younger age groups. And that's not to say that suicide attempts are less important, but it gives me an idea, again, of risk stratification. So how I categorize somebody in regards to, do I need to potentially step in? Do I need to look at hospitalization or getting law enforcement involved? Men are by far more likely to successfully commit suicide than women. On the flip side, women are more likely to attempt suicide. So again, another risk factor to take into consideration. From a race and ethnicity standpoint, the data shows that white or Caucasian ethnicities are much more likely to have a completed suicide than other races and ethnicities. The least likely to have a completed suicide are Hispanic, Asian, and Black categories of ethnicity and race. So we went through some statistics. Hopefully we all survived. Now, is that important? Absolutely. Please do not push that data aside as fun facts. Using that data allows us to identify who is at risk for having a completed suicide. So if I have a male in their mid-50s who is a hunter, who has access to firearms, who's saying, I am extremely depressed and I'm thinking about suicide, that sets off alarm bells for me, because this is an individual who hits all of those really high risk factors. And so I need to take this really seriously, and may or may not result in a hospitalization of some kind. It's a case-by-case thing. But again, this just gives me ideas for risk factors. Now, does that mean I treat a female age 19 any differently who says that they're suicidal or depressed? Absolutely not. But when it comes to a decision-making process, it's important. So if somebody's suicidal and they have firearms, the number one thing to do, make sure they don't have access to the firearms. Poisoning, we said, was the second one. Make sure that all the potentially dangerous medication and substances are locked away or taken out of the house. I'm sorry, we said poisoning was the third most common. The second most common was suffocation. That's hard to, it's a little bit harder to limit somebody just because there are various ways for that. But again, this is understanding risk factors so that we can help those in need. So let's actually talk about suicide now. The first thing is, let's run through some definitions. The most obvious one is suicide, and hopefully we're all aware of what the term suicide entails. So suicide is defined as the purposeful taking of one's own life. Again, that should be self-explanatory for the most part. Some of these other terms, though, that we have in the medical field are not quite as obvious. So suicidal ideation, that's a term that is used often. That means somebody's thinking about suicide. And there are two categories of suicidal ideation. You have active suicidal ideation, or SI, or you have passive suicidal ideation. Active means that the person is actively pursuing taking their own life. They've got a plan in place, they've gone out and they've gotten the materials, they're getting their affairs in order. Active SI is concerning, to say the least. Passive SI, on the other hand, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, But passive suicidal ideation is often a symptom of depression. It doesn't mean that the person needs to go to the hospital or have anything drastic happen necessarily, but it means that their depression is significant enough that they're starting to think about how can I escape the pain that I'm in. So that's suicidal ideation. A suicide attempt means that somebody has attempted to take their own life in some form or fashion. A suicidal threat is a verbal, somebody is voicing that they're going to commit suicide. No action has been taken yet. They're posturing. Now, this can be a cry for help. Somebody saying, I'm gonna kill myself. It can also be an attention-getting tactic. And you have to be able to tell the difference between the two. But a suicidal threat is the vocalization of the potential to commit suicide. A suicidal gesture is the action of it's the action form of a suicidal threat. So the person isn't attempting to take their own life, but they're starting to go through the process. That could take the form of cutting for some people. It could be, sort of setting the stage, getting things in place. All of those types of things are suicidal gestures. And again, that can be a cry for help, or it can be a way of expressing the depth of a person's depression. So those are some of the terms. Now, suicide. So we've talked about some of the statistics. We've talked about some of the terminology that I'm going to be using through the rest of this session. But the first thing I want to talk about is probably the biggest question that people have with suicide, and that is why? Why does somebody commit suicide? Why did they maybe give up or give in? Or why were they overcome? Why would they do this to me? Why would they do this to a loved one? There are lots of questions surrounding suicide, and I wish I had the answer. But unfortunately, in most cases, we don't know. We don't know what was going through the person's mind. We don't know how things got that bad or how they came to that conclusion. What I have come to the conclusion, though, is that there are 3 reasons why somebody commits suicide at the end of the day. The first reason is that an individual becomes hopeless. They lose hope for the future. They don't see any reason for existing. They don't feel like they're ever going to feel better. They don't feel like the situation they're in is ever going to improve. And that hopelessness is a very potent indicator for suicide. The second thing that I've identified is that suicidal individuals tend to feel helpless. They don't feel like they have any control. They don't feel like they have any chance of regaining a will to live. And the third factor is compromised decision-making. And this one's a little bit more tricky. Compromised decision-making may mean that somebody's under the influence of a substance. Compromised decision-making may be the presence of another mental health condition, such as psychosis. But those 3 things tend to be the why of why somebody commits suicide or attempts suicide. So they feel hopeless, or they feel helpless, or there's compromised decision making. So what does a suicidal person look like? Or what do they sound like? What do they say? I ask this question a lot when I'm doing presentations for people, and I get lots of really good and thoughtful answers. I hear things like, they look sad, or low motivation, low energy, or maybe they're angry. And all of those things are true, among many, many more. But usually what I do is that I get people to give me their answers, and then I say yes to all those things, and then I say, and none of those things. Because there are some people who are suicidal that you would never in a million years guess that they were suffering in that form or fashion. Yes, a lot of people, you can tell that they're depressed. You can tell that something's off. They're just not acting their usual selves. But a lot of times they don't show it. People put on a face, they put on a mask that they wear, and they struggle on the inside. So what does a suicidal person look like? It looks like you. It looks like me. It looks like everyone and anyone. You cannot look at somebody and say, that person's suicidal. And you cannot look at somebody and say, that person is not suicidal. So if you can't look at somebody and identify them as being suicidal, how do we and how can we identify somebody who's suffering from depression severe enough that they're considering taking their own life? In the medical world, we have screening tools. Screening tools are specific questions that help us basically score somebody on how depressed they are and if or if not they are likely to develop suicidality. The most common tool that's used in the medical world is the PHQ-9 questionnaire, and that is 9 questions having to do with depression. Things like, have you experienced any lack of interest in doing things, feeling down, depressed, trouble falling or staying asleep, feeling tired or having low energy, things like that. And then we have a scoring system. Now, hopefully, if you're not if you're not a part of the medical field, hopefully you're not, having a questionnaire for friends and family to fill out to identify whether they're depressed or not. So if you don't have that, though, how can you get that same information? And that's where rapport comes into play. Rapport is a fancy word that we use in the medical world to say, what's the relationship like? The most effective way to identify somebody who's struggling with depression and especially with suicidal thoughts is to have good rapport with them, so to have a good relationship. Rapport is the secret to success in helping someone who's suicidal. Somebody who's suicidal, they often don't talk about it. There's a huge stigma, and it's getting a little bit better, but there's an enormous stigma for having a mental health condition. Nobody wants to come out and say, I'm depressed, I'm thinking about committing suicide. It's something that too many people keep inside for a lot of different reasons. One of those reasons, maybe there's a consequence of confession. If I tell my friend that I'm suicidal, are they going to treat me differently? If I tell my mom, is she going to treat me differently? If I tell a school counselor, are they going to call the police? For adults, it may be if I admit that I'm depressed to the point of thinking about suicide, are my kids going to be taken away from me? From a custody standpoint. Am I going to lose my job? So many different factors play into this. And in severe depression, there can even be apathy, which is a term that means just the person doesn't care anymore. There's no point to talk about depression or suicide because they feel like they're too far gone at that point. So when you have a good relationship with somebody, they're going to be more likely to open up and talk with you. That's probably a number one question that I get asked when I talk about suicide is, how can I help somebody? And the answer to it is, be their friend, get to know them, be there for them. It's got to be sincere. But the closer you are with somebody, the more likely they're going to be honest with you about the way that they're feeling and what they're experiencing. So when you have good rapport with somebody, you're going to be much more likely to be in a position to help them in times of need. So how do we build rapport? The number one thing is spend time with somebody. The more time you spend, the closer you're going to get. Now, is time enough? No. But I'm sure we've all been in awkward situations where we've been spending time with somebody, but there hasn't been any actual communication or engagement going on. So yes, spending time is important, but you have to engage the individual as well. Communication is not about what you say. It's much more about how you say it and in the way that you say it. Colloquially speaking, meaning that this is sort of the general belief, I don't have any science to back this up, we consider 60% of communication to be nonverbal. So it's your body language, it's the expression on your face. 30% of communication is the way you say what you say. So it would be the difference of me saying, that was awesome, versus that was awesome. Yeah, so my pitch, the vocal inflection that I have, throws off a very different message depending on how I say what I say, and that's syntax. And then the last 10% of communication is the words that come out of your mouth. So think about that. Only 10% of the words that you're saying is communication. The vast majority of the rest of how you engage with other humans is your body language, facial expression, and how you say what you say. So all of those things you have to take into consideration when building rapport, when building a relationship with somebody. Be honest, be sincere. It's not going to work to roll in on somebody in a hallway of school or work who is in tears and to say, tell me what's going on. Yeah. You have to be honest and sincere in your interest and investment in somebody. Again, this is to build rapport. Now, does that mean that you shouldn't waste your time asking somebody what's wrong? Absolutely not. Because it's those little choices that you make that can sway the person on making a life-changing decision. But again, the better your rapport, the better your relationship with somebody, the more likely they are going to be to confide in you and to turn to you for help if they're feeling depressed or suicidal. So in review of part 1 in our discussion of suicide, we talked about some of the statistics related to suicide. We talked about terms used in discussion of suicide. We talked about the why of someone might commit suicide. And then last of all, we talked about the identification, specifically that it's important to build a relationship with somebody if you want to be in a position to help them. There is much more to come in this discussion on suicide. I will be releasing part 2 of this discussion here over the next week. I hope that you found this information helpful. There's much more to come. I will look forward to seeing you at our next session, but until then, please take care.